So, how has everyone's Spider-Man/Jump Festa weekend been going so far? Mine is good. I felt like No Way Home was the perfect example of what a feel-good movie should be. The anime had some really good stuff this week. My only complaint is that at times, especially in the beginning, it looked like Kaido's animation was all over the place because sometimes he would look really cool like this, and then moments later we would get a very brief shift to something like this, N64 version of Gyarados. But a lot of the Scabbard stuff looked outstandingly good. I knew that the Scabbards could use Rio, but what I didn't know was that they could turn into Skittles at the same time. I thought it was great. I loved how we saw Odin's will sort of flowing through their Haki. And I also liked the inclusion of the banter of each of the Scabbards sort of talking about their favorite food, because as we know, each of their favorite foods were revealed in an SBS, and each of them is actually an ingredient that goes in Odin. The episode just kind of got me excited, because if this is how they're handling the Scabbards, can't wait to see what they do with the 5 Supernova fight once they get to the top. Alright, so this week we start off with Oda stopping the cover requests and giving us a cover story. And I think it's very fitting chronologically that it revolves around the Vinsmokes, because we just got a reminder about them in the previous chapter. I really want to see where the family ends up and who they meet along the way. I'm definitely more excited about this cover story than I was for the Capone cover story. What scares me is that in the Capone cover story, we actually ended up running into Pound. So as long as Germa doesn't run into a living, breathing Pedro in this, we're good. No Pedro in this, please. Just no Pedro. The chapter starts off with Sanji, and he's literally doing the thing that he said he was going to do last chapter, which is to send Queen flying. The thing is that when he said that, I never thought it was going to be this literal. So Queen is completely KO'd in this, which actually really surprised me, because I was expecting Sanji to have to pull one more move against Queen. I thought Oda was going to save the finisher for this chapter, but nah, I think he was just like, I've given Sanji enough power-ups already, so let's just end it here. I appreciated the scene with Chuji and Osome because, like I said in my last video, that mouse was not random. It's obviously a reference to Sanji's childhood. So I think the scene provides a lot of closure for Sanji's character, because before, when he was a kid, he couldn't protect himself, and he also couldn't protect the mouse. And so now that he's older and wiser, he can do both of those things, right? He can protect himself, he can protect the mouse, and he can also protect the girl. So Oda gave the narrative thread that he started back in Whole Cake Island a pretty sweet ending with this scene. After that, Sanji collapses due to exhaustion, and it goes back to what Queen was saying in the previous chapter about how, because Sanji was moving so fast, right, the moment that he actually stopped moving that fast, he was going to run out of stamina really quick. And so the last chapter was called Sanji versus Queen, and this chapter is called Zoro versus King. And so it does bring up the question of, should we expect Zoro to also be out of commission by next chapter? Are we going to get a similar scene to where we see King KO'd in the beginning of 1036? Will Zoro also be out of stamina after this, or will the mink medicine grant him a little bit more time? We go to the basement and Zoro makes an observation about King that is actually present in the story since chapter 1027. Because in that chapter we actually see Zoro being able to damage King's mask, and in the moments where he's able to do that, we clearly see that the fire on King's back isn't active. So when that happens, King sacrifices defense for speed. And so we see the opening scene in the basement, and we see that Zoro has been able to damage King's face enough to unmask him because King's flames are out. So we get to see King's face for the first time, and to me, honestly, he looks like the One Piece version of a Targaryen. If Oda ever drew a Targaryen in his story, this is what it would look like. Even has the braid. And I kind of mentioned this the first time that we got a glimpse of his face, but he really does look like Wiper to me, to some extent, especially when he was younger. And I was honestly expecting some kind of a goofy design, some kind of a gag. But no, this guy seems pretty serious. Just cool and intimidating. And so that got me to think about Queen's comment about King being a sadistic pervert. So I was kind of left wondering, is this comment ever going to be explained further in the manga or in an SBS? Why did Queen refer to King this way? Also, King's tattoo on his face looks a lot like an olive branch to me, but more on that later. So some of the fodder that were on the ground because of Zoro's Conqueror's Haki notice King's face, and one of them has one of those reactionary jackets, so you can see that he has the word mask printed on his back. And then King activates his fire on his sword, and the flame actually turns to magma. So I think there's a lot of very interesting things going on in this scene all at once. The first thing is the structure. It's very similar to the Katakuri scene with his merienda, where the chefs see his face, And Katakuri gets so upset about that he takes them out immediately. He even stabs one of them with his trident. So it's a very similar dynamic here with King, where he activates his magma and just burns these fodder alive. The other thing is the significance of the symbolism with the dragon, specifically an Eastern type dragon that not only resembles Kaido and Momonosuke, but also resembles the statues that we've seen both in Wano and in Fishman Island, both of which have a very long history, right? These are kingdoms that are pretty old, and it's been very strongly hinted that both of them have some type of connection with the ancient kingdom, right? With the Void Century and with the people that were defeated by the world government. Another thing about this is that I think this is also Oda's way of indirectly hyping up Akainu, because if you remember back in Marineford, we saw Akainu use his magma in a very similar way, where he can create like hounds and like, sort of like magma dogs from his attacks. And so after King is done burning the fodder on the ground, we see that Zoro had to jump through the hole in the ceiling in order to avoid getting hit by the magma dragon. And so after that, that's when the fight starts changing location, because King actually flies up there, starts shooting at Zoro again, and the fight ends up going outside. And so Oda once again finds a reason to not let Yamato run into more Straw Hats, which I find kind of strange. I want to know what he's planning. Why isn't Yamato allowed to run into more Straw Hats? Like, they keep barely missing each other. If Robin and Brooke had started running in the opposite direction in chapter 1032, they would have run into Yamato. If Sanji had stayed fighting Queen in the live floor, he would have run into Yamato. If Zoro had stayed in the basement, you get the picture. I mean, it's technically a good idea to move King, who's a pyromaniac, away from the basement, and that way he's not near any explosives that could detonate. So in a way, Zoro kind of just indirectly saved the island, or at least bought Yamato some time. But still, why isn't Yamato running into these people? Apparently the world government is willing to fork over 100 mil just for information on King's race. And so that's the equivalent of Dory and Broggy's bounty, each. Like I said, King goes into his Zoan form to chase Zoro, who's up above. And I do have to say that in his Zoan form, without the mask, King looks like a featherless chicken. So they take the fight outside again, and as I'm reading those panels, I can hear the metal or the steel sound effect that the anime uses for when Zoro clashes with somebody. You know, the ting, 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 ting. So King kind of just flies by, and then he perches himself on a boulder, and I was honestly expecting him to say something like, "It's over, Zoro. I have the high ground." And then Zoro mentions something that connects to what I said in my review for chapter 1033, which is that the purpose of Enma is to kill, including its wielder, right? So the hard part about learning how to fight with Enma is that you have to fight with a sword that is constantly trying to kill you. And so Zoro says that he doesn't have that much time left, that his time is limited. So he's thinking about, okay, like I kind of have to find a way of finishing this. And then in the panel after that, I'm guessing that King is using his observation Haki, because he actually says, "I can sense the threat you represent." So I think he's like sensing Zoro with observation Haki. We get a flashback to Kaido meeting King, and like I said before, King looks a lot like Wiper in this scene. I'm pretty sure that this flashback is taking place in Punk Hazard, because if you compare the facilities in the final panel of the memory, they look identical to the ones in Punk Hazard before the explosion. Now I want to do a little bit of a history recap really quick. So we know that Big Mom gave Kaido his double fruit after God's Valley, after Rocks ended up being defeated, right? And in the flashback that we get in this chapter, Kaido says that he's going to go on to form his own pirate crew. So this has to be happening after God's Valley, after Rocks being defeated. And we learned from one of the ZP0 guys that at one point, when the Navy actually captured Kaido, Vegapunk extracted Kaido's bloodline elements and used them to create Momonosuke's double fruit. So I'm wondering if this is the instance where Vegapunk got a hold of Kaido's DNA. I also think it's interesting that we don't see Kaido say that he wants to be king of the pirates in this scene. Instead, the emphasis appears to be on King asking Kaido if he thinks that he's going to be the one to change the world. Which reminds me of Roger and Rayleigh, right? When Roger recruited Rayleigh, he told Rayleigh, "Let's turn this world upside down." So the main motivation here is about creating change in the world. The title of Pirate King comes in a little bit later, after Roger obtains it, or after Roger begins being called the Pirate King. And it's already been implied by Kaido that his goal was to become the next Joy Boy. So I think that's kind of what convinces King. But just that one page, though, that one page of flashback has a lot of info. For one, we find out that King's original name isn't King. At one point in one of my previous videos, I said that it would be kind of funny in an ironic way if the guy named King didn't have King's Haki or didn't have Conqueror's Haki. But it turns out that King is actually not his real name. And just from what we get in this chapter, I think it's heavily implied that King actually doesn't have Conqueror's Haki. So that kind of takes care of that, because, his real name isn't King, so there's no irony there. I mean, that could change, maybe later down the road we get like an SBS or a Vivre card that actually says that maybe King does have King's Haki. Maybe he just can't use the advanced version of King's Haki like Zoro can. So bottom line is, we just don't know. We don't know if King actually had the basic version of Conqueror's Haki, and he just didn't use it in this fight. Now, I am kind of curious now, since King's name isn't actually King, I wonder what Queen and Jack's real names are. Now, what is King's name? So the official translation, both official translations, went with Alber, A-L-B-E-R, for King's name. However, I do know for a fact that settling on this name was not an easy decision, because I know that there was some debate about how to actually spell King's name, because in Japanese, from what I understand, the R and the L are interchangeable. Phonetically, there's something up with those two letters in Japanese. So that's why sometimes you hear like Monkey D. Luffy or Rufy, right? Or Laugh Tail and Raft Tail, as we thought it was originally, and turns out that it's Laugh Tail. Same thing with Zoro and Zolo, right? That's where the confusion comes from. So the translators were really having a hard time deciding how to spell King's name. In fact, one of the other translations that I read, I think called him Arbel or something like that. The point that I'm trying to make here is that from the different translations I read about how to translate King's name, they all seem to have one thing in common, which to me, like when I read all the different versions of his name, the thing that kept coming up was that it was very similar to another word, which is actually a word in Spanish, and that word is árbol. Árbol in Spanish means tree. Kaido says that they were testing King's endurance, right? We know of a very durable tree that exists in the world of One Piece, which is the Adam tree. We also have the Eve tree, so Adam and Eve seems to connect to the story of Genesis and the creation of the world. Now you might think I'm reaching, but because of the Adam and Eve reference, right? Because of like those references to the book of Genesis, my mind also goes back to Noah, right? Because the story of Noah and the flood, that's also part of Genesis. And we have an ark named Noah awaiting the return of Joy Boy in Fishman Island. In the story of Noah, after the flood, Noah sends out, well, first of all, he sends out a raven or a crow, and the crow never returns, right? He was trying to scout the area to see if there was some land, right, after the flood. So the crow never comes back, the raven never comes back. Notice that ravens have black wings, but then eventually Noah sends out a dove, right? And the dove returns with an olive branch. And we know that now as a symbol of peace, right? That's why we say, extend an olive branch to somebody that you want to sort of make peace with. So I find that interesting because when Oda revealed what each of the Straw Hats are thinking about constantly, Oda revealed what he's thinking about constantly, and he basically said that one of his main thoughts is world peace. So I find it interesting that King has an olive branch tattoo on his face, and he also happens to have wings like a bird. The missing link here is going to be what is the connection between King's race, the Lunarians, that have black wings, and the Skypians that have white wings. Also, according to the description that we get in this chapter, Lunarians have brown skin and white hair. And if you remember, there's another character in this story with white hair. I mean, aside from Rayleigh, because Rayleigh, he has it because he's old, but, there's another character that has white hair, and that's Robin's mom. I don't think it's just random that Robin's mom's name is Nico Olivia, because Olivia or Olivia sounds like olive, right? Or it comes from the word olive branch, olive tree. Not only that, but there is a tree in O'Hara that was known as the tree of knowledge, which is also a reference to the tree that was in the Garden of Eden, which is yet another reference to the book of Genesis. And then I also find it interesting now that Robin's mom decided to name her daughter after a bird. Last thing I'm going to say about this is that in chapter 1024, which is the chapter where Yamato meets Shimotsuki Oshimaru, Ushimaru actually takes off the top layer of his clothing, and we get to see that he has a tattoo on his back. And that tattoo, at first I thought it was kind of weird because when we see the tattoo, like, he's not really close up, like he's kind of like far away. So I thought that was interesting. I just took a mental note of that. And the tattoo has the Shimotsuki symbol, which is the two swords crossed, right? But on second inspection, if you go to that panel where we see the tattoo, we see that the swords are surrounded by an olive reef. So make of that what you will. I just thought the olive branch connection was pretty interesting. I also like the fact that after Kaido frees King, he tells him, like, I'll never sell you out, or, you know, I'll never let anybody else have you, or something like that, which goes back to like a bit of dialogue that Kaido had when he says that in his mind, pirates will betray you. In a way, I think Kaido is telling King, like, I won't betray you. Ever. So it goes back to, like, you know, what happened to you, Kaido? Like, who betrayed you? Who hurt you? We go back to the present and we see that Zoro has completely sliced the boulder that King perched himself on with Rengoku Onigiri, or Purgatory Onigiri. So that was the right move, you know, to take care of the high ground first. And that panel of him cutting the boulder is a complete replica of the panel that we got back in chapter 1024, where Shimotsuki Ushimaru cuts the boulder at the entrance of the cave so that Yamato can be free. Now, because King's flames are ablaze, Zoro decides that he's not attacking King at the moment, so he comes down on Zoro with another magma dragon, but Zoro's able to dodge it just in time to avoid the explosion, and then the two of them clash in the air with their blades, and this is where King activates the zipper function of his sword to try and disarm Zoro, but because Zoro is now consciously aware that he can use King's Haki, he actually activates a blast of his own Conqueror's Haki to push himself away from King and prevent himself from being disarmed. And I thought that was a really cool use of Conquerors there. I thought that was a really smart move from Zoro. Just push yourself away with your own Haki. So he lands on the floor with a spin, and King actually uses this opportunity to swoop down at full speed, sacrificing his fire, and Zoro actually allows himself to get hit with a kick. So Zoro has to let himself get hit because this is the moment where King is vulnerable, and so as Zoro takes the hit from King and allows King to get close to him, he uses this opportunity to charge up Sandai Kitetsu so that he can counter with a slash that actually does damage King this time by cutting him through the middle. Now there's some really, really good dialogue in this scene, this back and forth between King and Zoro in the official translation, so I'm just going to read you some of my favorite parts. So King says to Zoro, "So it seems you figured out the rules of my body." And then Zoro replies, "That's right, finally envisioning your own defeat." And then a little bit later, King says, "You are biologically incapable of defeating me." To which Zoro replies, "There's nothing I hate more than weak excuses." So I feel like this is a reference to this quote right here, where Zoro says that if the world pushes you around, you have to push it back because excuses won't save you. So the dialogue itself was just fire at the end here. King says, "I'll keep you in my memory as the feisty swordsman you were." And then Zoro has the perfect comeback, which is, "Don't worry, I'll carve it into you myself." And so this is really where the tide of the fight begins to shift, because as Zoro had said or mentioned in one of the previous chapters, he needed to figure out how King's ability worked. And so now that Zoro has that information, that kind of gets King concerned, to the point where he actually flies off of the island so that he can put some serious distance between him and Zoro. And so after the panel where we see King's face, like, being concerned, you know, getting scared, I think that's the last time where we see him with the flame on his back. Because after that, he just gives his fire over to his sword so that he can create another magma dragon to attack Zoro. So the point is, you know, I guess, like, you know, because he has that distance, he's thinking, like, you know, the best defense is the best offense. So he's leaving himself vulnerable because he doesn't have the flame on his back anymore, but he's also sending down, like, what I'm assuming is his strongest attack. And so Zoro kind of looks at that and he's like, well, if the best defense is a good offense, then you leave me no choice. I'm just going to have to cut right through your attack. And so once again, Zoro ends up cutting a dragon in the air, which is very symbolic because it links back to Ryuma. And a part of me kind of feels like this is Oda's way of saying that, yeah, Zoro is not going to kill Kaido, and so I'm giving you this instead. He cut a dragon made out of magma, which is hotter than fire, and he also cut it above the flower capital, which is what Ryuma did. And not only does he cut the dragon, but his attack is also strong enough to cut King's blade, you know, just completely breaks it, And then also he cuts King's wing. And that's going to be a problem because since King is flying outside of the area, outside of the perimeter of Onigashima, if King can't fly with one wing, he's going to end up falling to the ground, just like we saw Queen doing in the beginning of this chapter. And that's if King is still conscious after this, which I honestly doubt at this point. We get a brand new swordsmanship style for Zoro in this chapter, because we know that Itoryu means one sword style, Nitoryu is two sword style, Santoryu is three sword style, and then when he activates Ashura, it's Kyutoryu, right? That Q means 9, so it's 9 sword style with Ashura. And so in this chapter, we see that the name that Zoro gives this new style, it's technically still like a version of Santoryu, because it's still like 3 sword style, but the spelling of it is different. So he calls it Eno Santoryu. So if you notice, the first part of this is the N, which I think is a reference to Enma, and then the last part of it is Santoryu, which is 3 sword style, but it's not spelled the way that Santoryu is usually spelled. The Ryu is actually spelled like dragon in Japanese. So this goes back to the SBS where Oda said that if the Straw Hats that don't have Devil Fruit powers, if they were to get a Devil Fruit power, that he would want Zoro's sword to get Kaido's Devil Fruit power. So it's kind of cool how by the end, Zoro's Conqueror's Haki kind of turns into like an Eastern type dragon deal, like a snake. A dragon of black lightning that ends up cutting straight through King's magma. So now we can talk a little bit about Jump Festa and what the announcements were. There really wasn't like a whole lot of breaking news to come out of Oda's statement this year, if I'm being quite honest. He basically starts off his message by talking about how this year has been pretty celebratory because we've had chapter 1000, episode 1000, and then volume 100 all within the same year. He talks a little bit about his physical health, which I thought was interesting. He talks about having stiff shoulders and some back pain. You know, I actually have a middle back situation as well. So, you want me to crack it? No, but seriously though, people, I think fans, like a lot of fans, we know that one of the reasons for why Oda wants to, get on with the series and have it reach its end is because of his health. I don't think that's a secret. I think that's something that, if you read between the lines, like this is something that has been there, and so I just want to wish him well and hope he takes care of himself as best he can. He talks about the One Piece live action series and how the production is kind of moving slowly and gradually, which given what happened to the Cowboy Bebop live action series, that makes a lot of sense. Just taking it slow, taking their time, no need to rush. And then he talks about Film Red, which actually, funnily enough, kind of like goes back to what I said in my previous video, which I strongly suspect that there's going to be some canon material or canon-related material in the film, because he kind of teases, he says, will Shanks meet Luffy in Film Red? So yeah, I just kind of suspect that there has to be some canon aspect to that movie. Speaking of the movie, we also got to see some Straw Hat outfits for the film. Usopp definitely has the craziest look out of all of them. Looks like a rock star. Get it? Rock star? Because they're going to meet Shanks' crew. Now, typically in these movies, the Straw Hats actually change outfits throughout the course of the film. So I don't think like these are going to be the only outfits that they have. Maybe just like the ones that they wear at the beginning of the movie. Oda then says that he's actually kind of surprised that it's taken Wano this long to end, which to me, I feel like that's kind of his way of apologizing for his previous Jump Festa statement, where he said that Shanks would be making a move in 2021. So I feel like that's kind of him acknowledging that he said that. He said, yeah, I know that's what I promised, but I honestly had no idea that Wano was going to take this long. Wano is ending though, because in the same message he says that he's been wanting to draw the final scene of Wano for a very long time. So I think it's like 100% certain that Wano will be ending next year. Finally, he kind of ends the message talking about how we should pay attention to Luffy as the main character, which is interesting because according to Sandman on Twitter, I think Sandman said that I think during the week or during these past 2 weeks, there was a radio show and Oda mentioned, he told somebody that the next time Nika shows up in the story, we're actually going to get to see his face. And it's interesting that Oda says pay attention to Luffy. Also, to celebrate the return of the Bleach anime, Oda actually drew Ichigo in his style. He actually released a statement for Kubo along with the drawing. Shout out to Sandman for the translation. And I knew something about the relationship between Oda and Kishimoto because of statements and interviews that I've read in the past. Their relationship is more like a friendly rivalry, but tending more towards friendliness. From what I understood, the two of them actually got to be a lot closer once Naruto ended. But when it comes to Kubo, I didn't know anything about like what the deal was between him and Oda. And so according to Oda's message to Kubo, apparently a while back, some time ago, Kubo publicly stated that he hated Oda. And I think the reasoning behind that statement was that he was upset, he was angry because One Piece was beating Bleach in the ratings. And so what Oda says in the message is that despite that statement from Kubo, he actually didn't dislike him because he respected his audacity to be able to say that publicly. And I think the reason for that is because that's a trait that is very consistent with Luffy's character, right? Luffy doesn't care who's on top, doesn't care like what your title is. He'll call you out. Like if he feels something, he'll call you out. So I think that's what Oda thought. Like, well, this guy, he's, coming at me. He says he doesn't like me, but I respect that. I respect him being genuine about it. And so if you read the entire message, the underlining tone of it is that Oda thinks that Kubo is a really hardworking guy. So basically he's saying that he respects Kubo. I do find it funny though that Oda decides to end his statement to Kubo by saying the exact same thing that Frankie tells Senor Pink after he's done beating the crap out of him. That's going to do it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. The biggest question that I have after reading this chapter is the fight actually over? Because you never know, I think everything kind of points to it being over, but I'm not 100% sure, so we'll just have to wait and see. It says here that the chapter officially, 1036, comes out on January 3rd, which means that I know technically other translations come out before then, but because I follow the official release, I'm going to have to wait. In other words, that means that the next time you see me or the next time I upload a video will be in 2022. So I'm going to have to wait for the official translation. So thank you for understanding. I'll try my best to give you the best review possible since I know that it's going to be some wait time for you. I thought this was a great chapter to end the year on officially because it felt like a culmination, right, to some degree. And I just want to say thank you for all of your support throughout the year because I've been trying to juggle two things at once with my other jobs. So really, honestly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. I know that 2020 was a very difficult year for a lot of people, right, all over the world. But for me personally, I actually found 2021 to be a lot harder than 2020. So, and one of the things that, helped me through it was your support. That helped tremendously. So that said, take care of yourselves. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, and I'll catch you guys in 2022. Bye.